Have you ever felt completely overwhelmed by your emotions and you wished you could gain control over them? I personally think that the skill of regulating emotions is probably one of the most empowering skills one can have. But is it even possible? Because modern neuroscience tells us that you can't suppress emotions. It just doesn't work. It's not feasible. So how do you regulate something you can't suppress? How does it even work? My name is Katerina Lengold. I'm a neuroscience researcher. I'm also a founder of Neurointegration Institute in California. And I'm a big believer in the power of understanding your brain. Because when you understand your brain, you become the author of your life. And all the things we want, success, happiness, joy, all of that comes from our brain activity. And in the past decade, we've learned more about brain activity than the entire history of humankind. So I personally think that it's a sin against yourself, the sin against humanity, not to use that knowledge. So my goal in this video is to share with you some of the research and specific tools that will change the way you think about emotions. We will talk about the ways that emotions are created in our brain and different ways they can be regulated. We will talk about differences in how we perceive emotions based on our stress levels. Apparently, stress plays a very important role here, and we need to understand it. We're also going to talk about suppression versus expression of emotions, and I will give you a list of ways how you can express your emotions, let them out, in a way that is healthy, and explain why suppressing them doesn't really work. And finally, I will share with you some strategies that will help you regulate emotions, that will help you change your relationship with emotions, not just in the moment, but long term. So let's get started. First, let's talk about how emotions get generated in our brain. So when we feel happy or sad or excited or afraid, what exactly happens in our brain? And when I say the brain, it actually is not quite only the brain that is being influenced by emotions. Because emotions, they connect our rational, logical thinking part and our bodies, because they influence our hormones. They touch our bodies as much as they touch our minds. And I think it's pretty fascinating that they can exist in this beautiful intersection of mind and body. An important area for emotional generation is called limbic system, and specifically a very tiny area called amygdala. It's an almond-shaped area, and its goal is to ensure our survival by analyzing all the stimuli from the external world, millions and millions of data points, and then trying to see what in this whole stream of information is important. According to amygdala, important are things that either threaten our survival or are opportunities that help our survival. So threats and opportunities are filtered through this amygdala filter, and as a result, amygdala activates if it finds something that it deems important, and it creates emotional response. So when we feel positive emotions, that means in this whole stream of stimuli, millions and millions of data points, amygdala finds something that is good for our survival. For example, we see a familiar face of a friend and we feel happiness and joy, this positive emotion. Or we see somebody who looks kind of dangerous and we experience fear or anger, negative emotion. The goal of amygdala is not to be precise, but to be very fast and very efficient at processing lots of data and making quick, kind of black and white decisions about what is good and what is bad, what is wonderful, what is terrible. It's very much black and white because it doesn't have time to look at the nuances, context. So it's by definition very categorical. Its goal is to be quick. But in addition to this part of our brain that just filters this information and then, if necessary, triggers our brain and body either to move towards that stimuli, if it's positive, or move away, if it's negative, we also have secondary, kind of high resolution processing center that takes the information from external environment and does more in-depth analysis of what is actually going on. Is this guy actually a good guy? Or this guy is actually a dangerous guy? And that detailed high-resolution processing is conducted by a part of our brain called prefrontal cortex. It's part of neocortex that is located about here in our frontal lobe, and Its goal is to take things in a more detailed, context-aware way and to try to make sense of a situation with all the nuances. Whatever the outcome of that processing is, it's usually much more nuanced. It's not as black and white as the response of amygdala. And if neocortex decides that, you know what, actually, this is not a reason to be afraid. This guy is actually not a threat. It can down-regulate our limbic system. It can send signal down to the amygdala and say, you know what, chill. Everything's okay. I checked. There's nothing to worry about. And it's a really powerful kind of system where you have a quick, energy efficient amygdala and you have very detail-oriented, very nuanced, context-aware, but more slow and energy-demanding prefrontal cortex. There is an important but. Prefrontal cortex has limitations. It can't really process lots of things. It has very limited processing capacity because it takes time and it takes so much energy. It also requires that we're consciously aware of something so it can process it. So if we're unaware of some situation and we kind of run around the world not really paying much conscious attention to things, it's really hard for it to engage, and it requires skill and training of a particular area of the brain called anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, so we can control our conscious awareness a little bit better. So it's not a default thing, and this is number one. Number two, our prefrontal cortex doesn't really work well at times of stress. And when we are stressed, we have elevated cortisol levels in our bloodstream. And when we have elevated cortisol, our amygdala becomes more sensitive, while our prefrontal cortex and its activity becomes suppressed. So as a result, our capacity for this high resolution, nuanced, kind of context-aware processing gets eliminated. And all we have is this fast, black and white, not always accurate processing by amygdala. We become more emotional because amygdala becomes more sensitive, and we become less rational because our prefrontal cortex becomes suppressed. So we can't see things clearly and logically. So this is very interesting, I think, and this is something you should keep in mind when you think of emotions and emotional generation. It's a mechanism that is being controlled by two very different areas of the brain. One more kind of reactive and very efficient and fast, and the other one more logical, more precise, but taking its sweet time to process things and not really working well in stress. The next thing I want to talk about is how do we express emotions and suppress emotions. So let's start with suppressing emotions. We can't do that. The reality is we don't have a turn off or delete button in our brain. So whenever we're trying to suppress something, some thought, the thought actually becomes much more powerful. So if I tell you, hey, do not worry, dear passengers, please do not worry. Okay, now I'm worried. Please do not think about a pink elephant with big pink ears. Guess what you're thinking about now? So our brain is not really good at not doing something. It actually does the opposite. So what we know based on the research and data from numerous scientific papers is that the moment we're trying to suppress emotion, we're trying not to show it externally, we're actually increasing activation of our amygdala and we're increasing the stress load. So whenever we are trying not to demonstrate to the rest of the world and keep it to ourselves and just kind of conceal the emotion in us, what ends up happening is that we increase the intensity of emotional response and we struggle more. It takes longer for us to recover, and there is psychosomatic potential downstream effects of it. Suppressing emotion is not a good idea. How do you act instead? So if you're feeling this overwhelming emotion, how can you channel it? How can you express it in a healthy way? And there are a few things you can do, specifically 5 things I can recommend. Number 1 is crying. And the reason why crying helps is because it changes our breathing pattern. So when we breathe while crying, we often do something which neuroscientists call physiological sigh. We inhale through the nose twice, and then we exhale through the mouth with sound, with a little moan. So I think I'm making very funny sounds right now, but my point is that crying is a very interesting mechanism that exists in our body that naturally calms down our nervous system through a very particular pattern of breathing. So crying actually does help, and if you feel like crying, do cry. It does help regulate emotions and does help express them. The second thing you can do, which I highly recommend, is moving. Because when we are experiencing intense emotion, it creates changes in our body. Specifically, we have high levels of adrenaline and cortisol in our bloodstream, which means that our muscles are ready to go. We have higher levels of glucose in our blood. So we have everything we need to jump into action. And if we don't move, if we don't act, then we have those elevated levels of hormones that are not utilized, and it's not good for our bodies. It's really good to move, to run, to box, to dance, do whatever it takes to let our bodies do what it was preparing to do, which is to move. So physical activity, and the intensity of that activity is up to you, but it's really, really helpful when you're feeling intense emotions and a good way to express them. Number 3 is talking. When we connect with somebody, when we talk to somebody, and when we verbally process what we are experiencing, it reduces the intensity of emotions. So venting and just kind of going almost in circles, explaining to somebody how you're feeling, it's wonderful for emotional regulation, for letting those emotions not get stuck in you. So I highly recommend talking to somebody you trust. If you don't have somebody you can talk to right away, I love using this simple tool, a pen and paper, to let myself vent on paper. So just writing my stream of conscious for 15 to 20 minutes, extremely important, therapeutic, and soothing. It's a great way to express your emotions. If you feel angry at somebody, you can write a very angry letter. Just handwrite it and then just burn it or throw it away. Don't send it. It's a really powerful way to process your emotions, to express your emotions. Interesting thing, the reason why I say don't send it, the way your brain works during the intense emotional response, as you already know, is different because of prefrontal cortex deactivation. So you are not really thinking logically. It's hard for you to empathize with other people. It's hard for you to think long term because all of those functions rely on prefrontal cortex. So chances are you will regret sending that email or that letter. So just write it down. Let the emotions be expressed without any long-term consequences. Number 4 is listening to music. In particular, if you can find music that kind of resonates with your emotional tone. So if you have sadness, then some sad melancholic music, or maybe angry, you feel angry, like some rock and heavy metal, whatever just kind of matches your emotional tone, super helpful. And if you want to sing along, even better, because when you engage your vocal cords, you're stimulating vagus nerve, which calms your nervous system. So extra bonus points for singing loud. That's why singing in the car really helps get it out of the system. And finally, number 5 is creating, writing poetry, creating art. A lot of artists use emotional drama of their lives in order to create things. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to create drama in your life so you have sources of ideas for creating things, but if you feel emotions, they're very intense, it could be a good opportunity to channel them using art. Even if you're not an artist, doesn't matter. It's a great way to express your emotions. All right, now let's move to emotional regulation. So as I said, you can help your emotions here and now through emotional expression, for the tools that I just gave you, but you can also change your relationship with your emotions long term. And I'm going to give you 3 steps that you can use in order to improve your relationship with your emotions long term. So step number 1 is working with your stress levels, and specifically with chronic background stress. I probably should record a separate big video on stress and stress regulation, but the point is, it's a losing battle. If you have background stress, that means you have heightened sensitivity of amygdala. And if you have heightened sensitivity of amygdala, that means that even the tiniest little thing will trigger you. It's really hard to regulate your emotions when everything and everybody is triggering you, which is exactly what happens when there is chronic background stress. So emotional regulation long-term starts with managing stress levels, and there are tools for that. And there is neuroscience behind it. So it is very much possible. You're not a victim of stress. You can manage it. So I will make sure to make a video on that topic, but please, before you try to work on your emotions with any cognitive tools that I'm going to give you, think about your stress levels. It's a really important piece of the equation. Step number 2 that you can use in order to regulate your emotions is to move to observer seat. So we talked about 2 systems, like the slow resolution system of processing and generating emotions, limbic system, and our prefrontal cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex, which can observe, kind of step back and look at the situation objectively and say, you know what, actually things are not that bad. So you have those 2 parts of you. So when you say, I am angry, that is actually not true, because there are parts of your brain that are not angry, that are just observing the anger that is happening in other parts of the brain. So when you recognize that you are not the emotion, you are just a place where emotion unfolds, and there is an observer self out there that can just look at it and be like, interesting, okay, I notice, I acknowledge that there is this emotion, but it doesn't define you. Don't merge with it. So whenever I feel like this overwhelming anger, frustration, I try to notice that this is not me who's frustrated, but rather that I notice the emotion of frustration. And when you create this mental separation, things get more interesting. And what effectively happens is when you turn into this observer self, you're activating anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, which then helps you engage your prefrontal cortex. And so now you have this cognitive superpowers, you have this high resolution processing available for you to look at the situation from a different angle. And this is step number 3. When you use cognitive control, your prefrontal cortex can down-regulate amygdala. The more often you use it to down-regulate amygdala, the more powerful this down-regulation becomes, the easier it is for you, even for bigger emotions, to be able to down-regulate it. So you need to train it and start with like small little annoying situations and grow bigger. So whenever you feel you have this emotional spike, you move to the observer seat and then ask yourself, can I look at this differently? Change interpretation. Because when you are looking at something from the perspective of amygdala, everything is black and white. Everything is either wonderful or horrible. So you can ask yourself, am I looking at this in a black and white manner? It's called cognitive distortion. So he's always doing these things. Is he really always doing it, or it's just been a second time he did that? He looked at me kind of funny, must hate me. Well, maybe he wasn't even looking at you. Maybe he was thinking about something else, and you just like perceive that as him looking funny at you. And does it really mean that he hates you? Maybe he's just having a hard day. So what are the potential possible other interpretations of what you have just perceived? How sure are you of that black and white horrible scenario and horrible interpretation? You using this observer self in your prefrontal cortex, you question your facts, you question your interpretations, and you start seeing that, you know what, everything is not that black and white. Now that you see that there's more to the story, you can brainstorm solutions. And oftentimes we feel stuck, emotionally stuck, when we feel like there's no way out. Like it's all or nothing, and we feel very kind of constrained in terms of options, how we can act. The reality is there's so many ways how we can react to the exact same situation. And so you can brainstorm ideas, and the more ideas you have how you can respond to a particular situation, the more free you feel. So this whole idea of being the author of your life is a product of seeing many options of how you can react. And then finally, you should commit to some action, because when we look at the situation in a more flexible way, we look at our options that are available to us, and then we pick how we're going to respond to the situation. We engage parts of our brain that want to be in control. And then there's interesting research that shows us that when we feel like we're in control, we're in the driver's seat, we can influence the situation. The levels of discomfort and pain and stress goes down. So it is very important for us to plan, to make choices. And so once we have those options, we can sit down and think, okay, so how do I want to react here? And we align it with our values, we align it with the available tools and resources we have, and we make a decision how I want to react. And all of that together changes the whole dynamic. You're no longer a victim of your emotional state. You are the author of your choices. You are the author of your life. Let's try to summarize that. In this video, we talked about the creation of emotions and the role of limbic system for kind of quick and dirty interpretation of external stimuli, and prefrontal cortex that does an incredible job to fact check it based on the nuances and context with certain limitations, because it requires a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and stress actually disrupts that system because it increases the sensitivity of amygdala. It can even make it bigger, by the way, and decreases the activation of prefrontal cortex. So we become more emotional, more impulsive, and less logical. We also talked about the fact that we should not try to suppress emotions, that it doesn't work. In fact, it actually increases the activation of the limbic system, but instead we should look for healthy ways to express our emotions. Crying is great, moving is wonderful, talking or writing is also very helpful, listening to music and singing when it aligns with our emotional intensity, and finally, creative process is also very welcome. And finally, we talked about the ways how you can change the relationships with your emotions and regulate them in a long, sustainable way. We talked about reducing background stress, because otherwise it's an uphill battle. We talked about moving to observer seat, activating our ACC, activating our prefrontal cortex, and acknowledging emotions but not merging with them. And finally, using cognitive control, where we question our facts and question our interpretations, brainstorm options, and then commit to a specific plan so we feel like we are in the driver's seat. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you found it interesting, and share it with friends so more people can use those tools to understand and regulate their emotions and become the authors of their life. Again, my name is Katerina Lengold. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.